Welcome, Prime Minister. I'm very happy that the Prime Minister could make this. As I told you all this morning, I had no idea when we timed this conference what would happen on Saturday. I don't know which the Prime Minister regrets more, having accepted this invitation or scheduling the by-election on Saturday. If I might start by asking the first question. For close to 50 years now, the Singapore government has subjected itself to the electorate at regular intervals, sufficiently regular intervals, in order to ensure its honesty, but in the short term, but it was sufficiently assured of its position over the long term not to take opportunist, populist measures. Are you worried that the government will find it increasingly difficult to adopt long-term measures, given the new, what Professor Chan Heng Chee described this morning as the new normal in democracy?
I think it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for governments all over the world, even strong ones. Michael Bloomberg was here last year. He came to receive a prize, and he commented on how difficult government was because of the 24/7 referendum which took place in the social media. A heartfelt plea for sympathy for politicians. Before the day was out, it had gone back into the social media in America, and he had to backpedal on his words, proving his point. I don't think we can be exempt from these pressures. Whoever is the government, either this one or a future one, will have to manage them. But at the same time, if Singapore is going to prosper, it must be able to look beyond these pressures and muster enough consensus and support to be able to take measures which look beyond the next election. If you don't do that, you're going to be in serious trouble. Can it be done? It depends on the quality of a leadership. Depends whether the leaders have that trust and mutual confidence with the population. I think it also depends on how the population looks at issues and whether you are able to stand back and take a collective view that this is good for Singapore and so I'll go along, or whether you take partisan views. My group wants this and let's do it now. And I think it's our responsibility as a government to try and form Singapore society so that it is possible for us to the greatest extent to take a consensus perspective on issues, which means we must all have a stake in growth, in progress, and all feel that this society is going in the right direction.
Gillian, you want to ask the second question?
Prime Minister Gillian Koh, if I might follow up on that, sir. You closed up the hustings at Punggol East with a speech that said that the PAP is still committed to standing on the side of the people and that there have been changes in a certain direction to support people, not away from them, but towards them. There's been a lot of discussion today about whether the government can take a harder look at areas of healthcare, transportation, social support system, and perhaps look at a more comprehensive review of how you can reinforce this standing on the side of the people. I would just add that there was somebody in the room this afternoon who said that he himself was not very confident that when people say to help the needy, that they might themselves not be able to rise to the plate if it was put to them to help. And so it's, I suppose, not just the task of the government, but how much you think people are prepared to pay the price of a bigger role for the state. Thank you.
I think we are, in fact, moving considerably towards the state, towards more social support, towards greater transfers for the low income, for elderly. It's been a trend over the last 10 years, certainly since I have become Prime Minister. I think it's a response to the way our economy is maturing, to the way our society is aging. And I see that continuing. Do we need a more fundamental review? well, with the OSC, with the One Singapore conversation, we are headed in that direction. And we hope through the One Singapore conversation, we will have new ideas come up on what we need to do, what we can do, how we can do this to achieve what everybody acknowledges to be good objectives without running into what everybody ought to recognize as common problems which many good intentions have led to all over the world. The Europeans started off with good intentions. They are in a deep hole. The Americans started off with very good intentions with Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. It has not been an easy ride for them, and it hasn't totally solved their problems. So we have to go ahead. I think we have to do more. How to do it, how to involve people in this process, I think we have to find the right mechanism. But really, you want to do it in such a way that people do not feel that whenever you have a problem, it's the government which has to be there. One of our difficulties is that every time there's a problem, the first question which is asked is, what's the government going to do about it? And actually, sometimes the answer should be, what should the government do less rather than what should the government do more? It's very hard, but I think we have to consciously ask ourselves that question. As to how we are going to fund this and whether we are willing to fund this, I think that's a very legitimate question. Scandinavian countries are willing to go much further than most other countries. Their tax rates are very high. Their transfers are very generous. And people generally accept that, although even Scandinavians sometimes migrate to America and elsewhere, or Britain, in order to escape the taxes. In Singapore society, can we go that far? I don't think this generation is willing to do that. I doubt a future generation will be unless we change very substantially. But we can go further than we now are. What we want to avoid is thinking that more money is the solution to our problem. Because actually, you can find the money, but the solution to the problem is really more fundamental than that. Low income, the solution is to upgrade your skills so that you have more skills and you can earn better. Old age, the part of the solution is people have to stay active longer, in the society longer, therefore well and healthy longer. And many other broken families, the solution isn't just to be generous with the divorced wife left with stranded with her children, but to try and strengthen our families so that they stay together and don't get encouraged to split apart. These are all problems we will have to meet. For many years, we told ourselves we are doing fine. Other people have problems in Singapore, we have avoided them. It's partly because we did some right things, but it's also because at that stage of our development, the society was young, the economy was growing very rapidly. We could cruise ahead and in calm waters. And we have gone beyond that phase and we have to adapt.
Okay, Asad first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Asad Latif from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Prime Minister, in terms of, you did say about our Singapore conversation that the government could not be a note-taker and just make a list of demands for people. Yes. But you did also say that the government, that the party has to win elections in order to deliver. So there are these two objectives. Could I ask you, over the next two general election cycles, how do you see this new normal evolving? And in those terms, how do you see the government reclaiming the ground that it has lost to the opposition? Small ground, but still. How do you see the government reclaiming the ground? How do you see the new normal proceeding?
I think, as I alluded to just now, how the new normal progresses depends on how our society develops. I think the more we are able to keep our society cohesive and all groups seeing their interests together, I think the easier it will be for our politics to work. If a society is divided, the politics will reflect that. If the society is united, then you will have different views, but we hope along a spectrum and not polarized and extreme. It depends on the underlying economics and social forces, but it also depends, of course, on the way the political leaders play their cards and whether they're responsible or whether they go populist and rabble-rousing and lead us into trouble. As the government, we have a responsibility not only to win elections, but to make sure the country is governed in the right way and will work beyond the next election and the election after that. And I think the way to make it work is to try and bring in people who are both committed to Singapore and also have ability to contribute to Singapore. You need people who can identify and click with the ground. And it can be it's a visceral thing. Do I feel like you? Do I like you? Can I connect with you? But you also need people who have ideas and who can say, here, do this. Let's do this together, and can get people to work together to make things happen. And those are the sorts of people whom we are looking for. Individually, but more so as a team in the party, so that overall we represent the population. I think it's not so easy to do because as time changes, with the social changes, you are looking for people who are not just professionally successful, but people who represent different streams in our society. Different races, certainly, but people who are at the grassroots, people who are professionals, people who are social activists, people who are unionists. And if I have the right mix of such people with the right motives, I can make it work. It's not certain, but that's a way to maximize our chances.
Let me turn. Yes, please. Yeah.
Michael from Ngee Polytechnic. Prime Minister, just to pick up on something that you were saying just now, given the evolving situation in Singapore in respect of increasing political pluralism, which is sometimes expressed in more adversarial or confrontational ways, to what extent do you worry that a future Singapore could find itself in the same pitfalls as some of the traditionally liberal democracies, which are now plagued by this divisiveness and stymied by the inability to govern effectively? If so, how can Singapore avoid these pitfalls even as political pluralism continues to evolve? Not an academic question in my case, because I am a naturalized Singapore citizen. Thank you very much.
These are risks in our system, as they are risks in anybody's system. I think the conclusion we have come to, which many political scientists have come to, is that there's no system which is foolproof. Because if you try to put a safety net to catch every possible mishap, you change the behavior of the acrobat on top of the safety net. He does more ambitious and adventurous and dangerous things, and new problems will appear. And there's no ideal solution which can avoid that. In the end, if you look at the societies which work against the societies which don't work, it's not just the structure of the political system which makes a difference, but really it's the structure of the society. Do they feel at one? Are they stable? Are they able to work out their differences together? Or do they become polarized and agitated? Indian democracy, if they have elections and they have a parliament, works very different from Swiss democracy, where they also have elections and a parliament, but it's not half as exciting. And you don't even know who the president is because the ministers take turns to be the president. So we are not Swiss, we are not India. Somewhere in between, we must find a formulation which suits the temper of our people. And that temper of the population is something which is gradually changing over time because we are open, our people are influenced by the world, and when you have a disruptive change like the social media, it changes behavior and the outcomes. And I don't think Facebook is the last word in disruptive change.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Paul Anand Tambaya. I'm from the National University of Singapore. I'm a born and bred Singaporean, still doing my national service. My question is actually twofold. First, the topic of today is on governance. I'm wondering whether it would be possible in the near future, in the development of Singapore's democracy, to have a Freedom of Information Act and to have an independent election commission, and if not, whether you could explain some of the reasons why. Thank you.
I think on the Freedom of Information Act, I would not be in favor of it. The reason is the people who have done it have found that far from assuring freedom of information, you lead to more opaqueness and avoidance of records. Because if you know that everything you write down is going to be made public, a lot of things are not going to be written down. And if you know that the meeting is going to be minuted, then you're going to have a tea break or coffee break before the meeting. That's how it happens. And if you talk to some of the leaders who have been instrumental in introducing a Freedom of Information Act, like the British, I think Tony Blair did it as the first thing when he came into government. He bitterly regrets it. It did not lead to the good outcomes which he hoped for. Secondly, on an election commission, I think different countries do it different ways. In very few countries have they succeeded in making it depoliticized. In America, it's done by Congress, and if you look at the way they carve their constituencies or congressional districts out, it's explicitly carved so that you preserve the vote for specific members. And you may have the Jewish vote, you may have the black vote, you may have the Latin vote, and Hispanic vote. And you have very interesting shapes of congressional districts. There was once somebody who wrote a paper on how you could use a computer to do this optimally, meaning not to fix it optimally, but to arrange it so that it's as neat as possible. Little square boxes so that you have a logical electorate for politics, to elect congressmen. Never happened. Couldn't happen. So I don't think there is a good solution which can depoliticize the process. I think it's better to leave it as it is. The Prime Minister appoints a Boundaries Commission. The Boundaries Commission puts out a report, and you can see that it's overall balanced and fair. And if you look at the last general election, there were a few quibbles here and there, but by and large, people acknowledged that this was a fair demarcation, and likewise the one before that. So I don't think there's any way you can detach this.
The American congressional elections this year, the Republicans retained control of the House, but in actual fact, the Republicans nationally got fewer votes than the Democrats. They happened to get more votes, more seats, because most of the legislatures were controlled by Republicans. And therefore, as Professor Chan Heng-Chi said this morning, there were lots of salamanders. If I may follow up on the Freedom of Information Act, but short of a Freedom of Information Act, could the government do more to release information than it is now?
I think that is possible, and in fact we have been doing that. I sometimes think that we put out so much information that people are snowed under, and therefore when they say we didn't tell you, what they mean is we didn't hear you. And unfortunately that is so. I think we need to have a better impact when we put the information out, and there will be records and things which, if they're not sensitive, well, we should be quite prepared to share. Because nowadays, if you can put out the information, people can mash it up, can use it, you can make an app with it, you can do a lot of clever things which would be helpful. And we are encouraging that.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Prime Minister, for gracing this occasion. Ewan Murugesu from Jurong. This morning, Professor Chan Heng-Chi and Professor Kishore Mahbubani talked about political change and how Singapore is heading towards a more normal democracy. They discussed several scenarios and proposed a soft landing from a soft authoritarian government as the best outcome. They identified 4 core fundamentals which will characterize our government's overarching policies, which I understand to be the non-negotiables. Number 1, a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious approach. Number 2, maintaining law and order. Number 3, maintaining meritocracy. And number 4, a non-corrupt government. I understand these to be the 4 non-negotiables in our governance. So the question, first part is, would you agree with this overarching model of governance? Secondly, it was also mooted that the ground's political expectations have changed significantly since GE 2011, and there is no turning back as our political DNA now evolves towards this new, more normal democracy with a better educated, more sophisticated electorate. The question is, will the PAP re-strategize to engage this new landscape? And would the PAP also look at the rules of engagement with the emerging opposition MPs, for example, in the issue of management of town councils? And as was suggested at the last one, perhaps mayoral election. I think that was what was proposed at the last session. Thank you very much, sir.
I think the 4 principles which Heng Chi and Kishore described are in fact fundamental principles. They may not be the only ones. There will be other issues which any government will have to think about, not least being how to ensure a livelihood for Singaporeans, which is not to be taken for granted. But meritocracy, multiracialism, incorruptibility, and you had one more. Law and order. I think these are basic. Without these, the system goes down the drain. I don't know what landing you reach from the status quo. I think we started in an exceptional position after independence with the PAP in an overwhelmingly dominant position. I think the PAP is still in a very strong position, but if you look at it in half a generation or a generation from now, society will have changed, the PAP will have changed, and I'm sure the landscape will have changed. And I hope we can get from here to there in a stable, predictable, and secure way. It's not to be taken for granted, but it is something which we have to work towards. A model of governance, town councils, mayors, I'm not sure whether we want to have more levels of elections in Singapore. It's a small place. We would like to have authority devolved so that more things can be done at the local level. I mean, the town's constituencies, or a few constituencies, is one level. The mayors, which look after 1/5 of Singapore each, roughly, is another level. There are certain economies of scale. But you don't want it to become too multi-layered, because if you do that, it becomes very difficult to work. Secondly, you spend all your time doing elections, which is what happens in Taiwan. And one of our great advantages is that when people come to Singapore, they deal with the Singapore government, whoever that is, and that settles matters and you can proceed. You don't have to have a separate negotiation locally or in the district. So I think we have to evolve. We have to find ways where you don't make decisions too centrally, but you let the districts, let the mayors, let the town councils do more. And then we live with the untidiness. And you must be prepared to have people say, well, I was in that town council and he was more generous to me. And why is it you are more strict with me? And we already see that kind of issue happening. But that's the way it is. The short answer is, well, if he's more generous to you, you should be there. But sometimes it is not politic to say that.
Yes, please. Go ahead. Yeah, and then you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm Hsien from Singapore Polytechnic. So in 1933, then US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced the New Deal to the American people, effectively creating Social Security and paving the way for many other US social safety nets. Today, as we relook into our own social safety nets for Singapore, may I just point out that look at the trouble having social safety nets, such wide-ranging social safety nets has gotten the American people into. Not only they do not have the kind of financial reserves that we have, but they are also spending themselves daily into larger and larger debt. And while we focus on social safety nets, are we encouraging irresponsibility on the part of our citizens by guaranteeing them they will be caught if they fall off the line? Thank you.
That is a risk. And that is the reason why, although we have a lot of schemes to help people, we have avoided saying this is guaranteed. If you have no work, you can get money. Or if you grow old, rich or poor, here is your entitlement. Which is the case in many social welfare systems, and which leads to a lot of problems. You cannot say that you do nothing because anything you do will encourage people to become reliant. Because sometimes things happen to people, bad things happen, and we have to help. We have a mutual obligation to one another. Question is how we do it, how far we go, and how much responsibility we put on the person and on his family. I have often, those of you who have been at Meet the People sessions or have helped at Meet the People sessions will know that when people come to see you and you probe the case and you take the case history and you ask them about their family circumstances, very often you will find people who are in trouble, but they have family. And either the family is poor, cannot help them, in which case, well, we understand and we have to do a bit more and the society has to step in, or we get some VWO to step in. But sometimes the family is there and they just simply cannot get on together. And the old folk will say, you know, the young person, they make my life a misery. Every day they're scolding me, and my daughter-in-law is insufferable. Or my mother, sometimes it's not the in-law, sometimes it's a biological, your own child, grown up. Parent sold a house, moved in with a son or daughter, cannot get along, now come back to the state, please, can I have a rental flat? Subsidized, of course. What do I do? And, well, we try to help them, but it's not always possible to help every single one of them. And that's one of the issues which we will come up with. One of the risks which we have is that if we are too generous with welfare, we encourage families to split up. And then you have unstable families, and then you have a lot of problems with the children and the next generation, which is what has happened to the Americans. But the present American problem is a different one. The present American problem, welfare over the years with Bill Clinton and others, they've made reforms and changes and tightened up and adjusted. But the big thing, the elephant in their room, is health care, which is a big burden on the economy and a big burden on the US budget, government budget, and where everybody feels is extremely important and is not prepared to trade off. So they want to cut spending, they want to lighten taxes, they don't want to increase taxes, but nobody dares to cut or trim or rationalize Medicare, Medicaid, I think they have a third scheme, there are 2 or 3 of them, for old folks and for the poor. Or the prescription drugs scheme, which is hundreds of billions of dollars worth of money. And we are going to do more on health care because our people are aging, and I think some of them will need the help to make sure that they can afford the health care, but we have to be careful not to end up in that hole.
David, you had your hand? Yes.
Afternoon, Prime Minister. David Chan from SMU. We often speak about doing things right, doing the right thing and doing things right. I have a question, if you could shed some light on how government makes decisions and react to public in terms of 2 distinctions. The first distinction is being populist and being popular. Since not being populist doesn't mean that we have to be unpopular. The second distinction is about distrust. One could think about distrust as unhealthy, skeptical, non-factual, malicious distrust. But we could also think about distrust as positive concern regarding governance and transparency. So how do you deal with these 2 distinctions so that both actual and perception-wise it won't be confused?
Well, populist means you are doing something to please the crowd, but it's really harmful. At least that's how I would interpret it. I'm not sure if that's what the dictionary says. It's harmful not to me, but to the crowd, but you want it, I give it to you. Popular means I'm giving it to you, you're happy, I'm happy. And maybe does some good, sometimes does a lot of good. If I have a good housing policy, everybody has a home, I think that's popular. If I give the houses away for free and I don't worry about how I'm going to pay for it, that's populist. If I talk about how I'm going to spend without also setting out how I'm going to raise the money to spend, then I think I'm being populist. But if I tell you that, well, I'm going to increase social spending and GST is going to go up X% in so many years' time, I may or may not be popular, but I'm doing the right thing. I think what we are trying to do as a government is to try and package our policies so that they can be popular, but at the same time they can be beneficial to people. So when we are doing EduSave scholarships or EduSave merit bursaries or Eagles Awards, character awards for students, is it popular? Yes. I think the children who come who get the scholarships, they are very happy. They are recognized. The parents are very happy. They pose for pictures with you. I think it's a plus. Is it populist? No, it's not. It's the right thing to do. So we make that distinction. If you ask another politician, particularly if he's not in government, you probably will have different definitions. As for trust and distrust, I think I'm not sure I would put it as distrust being positive. I would say trust has to be nurtured. I appoint somebody, I trust him to do the work, but I also look forward to him keeping me on board and on side and explaining to me, what are you doing, why are you doing this, what is necessary, what will come next, what dangers do we fear may befall us, and please have a care. Tomorrow the storm is coming. Please prepare your umbrellas. I think there's a lot more need for that now than in the past because the population is more educated. A segment of the population is interested in what you're doing, and the specific interest groups, of course, will be very concerned. We're talking about green issues, talking about social issues, talking about education issues. Each one has a constituency, and I think those constituencies in the civic society, a lot of them, need to be nurtured and need to be taken seriously, and if we can engage them, that is a plus. If we can engage the whole population so that when you have a budget speech, the next day everybody knows 2/3 of the measures which have been announced, I think that is an outcome devoutly to be desired. It may take several more decades before we get there. Because that's not the way the public works. Everybody has his concerns, has his job, has his preoccupations, whether it's family, whether it's career, whether it's some other personal issues. And they are not governing the country. So the government has to bear most of the burden, but we have also to be open. And if you're asked about it, well, we will give you a full explanation.
Please. Yeah.
And sometimes even if you don't ask, we will want you to hear anyway.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for taking my question. I'm Leon Pereira. I'm here in my private capacity. I have two questions. Firstly, it's on the representativeness of our political institutions. In the last general election, the PAP scored 60% of the popular vote share, but secured, I believe it's 93% of the seats in Parliament. So that's roughly 33 percentage points disparity between the popular vote share and the share of seats in the legislature. If you look at all the major electoral democracies in Asia, as well as in the US and UK and so on, that is a far, far larger discrepancy between the vote share and the seat share. The next highest figure I've been able to find was Japan in the last election, which was 16 percentage points. So in that context, do you feel concerned that the key institution in our country, which is Parliament, is not as representative as it should be? It's not really reflecting the political complexion and the political aspirations of all Singaporeans? That's my first question. My second question is in regards to what has been discussed as recent policy missteps, namely the failure of housing and public transport stock in the past to keep pace with an expanding population. The government is working very hard, I think, to make some corrections in this regard. My question was really in terms of how that lack of coordination happened if we go back a few years. Do you think that Singapore would benefit from some transparent and open discussion about how the process by which the misstep occurred actually took place in terms of planning, in terms of coordination between the public infrastructure and the population, in the manner of, say, public hearings or commission, not so much to pinpoint blame, but to strengthen the system and improve it for future. Thank you.
Well, on the first question, on the representativeness of Parliament, I think there is a range of possible outcomes. Parliament is not meant to be strictly proportional to the popular vote. If you were, you would have a pure proportional representation system. And there are such systems in the world, like the Israelis come close, and I think they have very unhappy outcomes because in the end they're not able to have a strong governing party. If you have a first-past-the-post system, it tends towards a more decisive outcome and a clear majority for one party or another, unless the electorate is very split. In Singapore, it tends to a more extreme outcome because we are so homogeneous across the country. In Britain, you have safe seats for the Labour, you have safe seats for the Tory. If you are in Cambridgeshire or the home counties, pretty sure that the Tories will win, at least in the old days. If you are in Scotland, the Tories haven't got a chance. I think nearly every seat is Labour. And likewise, if you are in the Midlands, the working class areas. So you have two ends which are stable, and you fight politics in the middle, in the swing seats. In Singapore, every seat is a swing seat. It is, because if there's a swing, it's a nationwide swing, and today it can be very lopsided one way, tomorrow it can be very lopsided another way. And in fact, that is a factor in the very long term for instability. In the shorter term, what we have done to mitigate that is we've got NCMPs and we've got NMPs. So while the PAP after the last election had 81 seats out of the 87, in fact, there were 9 more NMPs who were added. There were 2 more NCMPs who were added. So it's not 92 to 8, but I don't know, about 80 out of 100. Still heavy, but we have made an effort to bring in and have representation in Parliament of alternative voices. And I accept that as we go forward, there will be more desire for plural voices in Parliament. And I think that will happen. As for the outcomes on housing, on transport, how did it happen? You don't need a commission or an inquiry to find out how it happened. I can tell you how it happened. It happened because we didn't have 2020 foresight. We went into the decade 2000, 2001, starting with 9/11. Economy went into a recession. Our growth was slow. Our population growth was slow. In fact, foreign workers went home in some numbers. And as far as we could see, we were in for a slow time. House prices went down. We didn't know how long this would last. By 2005, 2006, the mood changed. The economy began to pick up. I decided that we should try and make up for lost time. Because you want the economy to grow. You want Singapore to make progress. And you don't know how long the sun is going to shine. As it turned out, the sun remained shining for longer than we expected. So, the population grew faster than we expected. Our infrastructure didn't keep up. Should we have given ourselves more buffer and said, let's build and be ready? I think in retrospect, clearly, yes, we could have done more. Could we have predicted that we would have 5 years where the economy would grow brilliantly and our population would increase so rapidly? I don't think you could easily have said that. Should we then have said, I didn't plan for this infrastructure, let's tell the business to go away and let's forget about the growth. We don't need the IRs, we don't need these extra jobs. We just stay where we were. I think that would be very risky. So we went ahead, the strains showed up. It's quite instructive how they showed up. They didn't show up gradually, progressively, but quite suddenly. When the global financial crisis came at the end of the decade in 07, 08, we expected to go for a very deep dive. In fact, in one quarter, we had minus 10% growth. Nobody talked about house prices. There was no shortage. HDB, we watched the market every day. The resale market was dead. But we did the right thing with our jobs credit and our measures. We avoided a bullet. The world economy recovered faster than expected. In the middle of 2009, the wind changed. If you go back and look at the house price index, which I just did after our recent package, every month it was flat, 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 flat. But in June 2009, it's a tremendous blip. And those of you who were in the business at that time will remember that in the course of 2 weeks, during 1 or 2 private property launches, somehow the wind changed. It's like the spring breeze touched your face. And the market was off. By August, we were thinking of measures to cool things down. And we have been trying to cool things down ever since. So, we lacked that 2020 foresight. Next time we will try to do better, certainly to have a bigger buffer and not to cut things so fine. But I think it's very difficult to know 10 years from now how many you will need. Even if you know how many persons there will be in Singapore, you can't say for sure how many houses they will need. Will they buy it? Or will they say, no, I'm not certain because the economy is not looking good or because the politics are uncertain and, well, I'll hold off. But when the market goes up, it goes up with a vengeance and, well, we've paid a political price. We learn from it.
That answer will probably make the headlines tomorrow. So if there is a follow-up first to that, and then I'll get you. Do you have a follow-up to that? Is somebody else? No. You want?
There's a question there.
Okay. Asa, you have a follow-up to this? Okay. Yeah.
Should I go ahead?
No. Good. More moment. Yeah.
Prime Minister, pardon my ignorance, but you said that when you were looking at the situation from 2005, expecting more people to come in, and you're saying that you wanted to bring the business in, even though at that point of time things were uncertain. That part I can understand. But surely in terms of the number of people, the immigrants that you wanted to bring in, which has become a big issue now, how did you decide, what the numbers would be? So I'm not talking about the business, but the immigrants.
The immigrants are not really immigrants because the immigrants, many of them are foreign workers or professionals. And you don't really know whether they will stay or they will not stay. In 2003, or 01, 02, 03, after the 9/11, when we had a slowdown, many of the foreign workers went home. And in fact, their numbers dipped. So our attitude is, when things are good, we let them in. If I'm a bit crowded, I live with the crowding. When things turn down, we let them go home. And, well, meanwhile, I've benefited from them. On that attitude, we grew in 05, 06, 07, 08. We shrank in 09. But we grew quite fast, and in 09, when the economy shrank, we shrank less than expected, and fewer of the foreign workers went home than expected. So that was a surprise.
So on that point, Prime Minister, how far is it possible to actually fine-tune these things as you go along?
What I've been trying to tell you is that it's not possible.
That's right, yes. Right.
And you have to make a stab at it. You have to make your best guess, build in some safety factor, and even then it may turn out differently than you had planned. If I ask you, tell me, how many Singaporeans do you think there will be in the year 2020? I can make a guess. And tomorrow we are publishing the white paper on the population, and it will make a guess of a range of what might be and on what we need to do in terms of jobs, in terms of infrastructure, houses, public transport. We'll make sure we have a good quality of life for Singaporeans. If I ask you what will it be for 2030, I think the uncertainties are even greater. It's a best guess. How quickly can things change? Sometimes within a few weeks, like I described to you when the property market turned in 2009. Sometimes within a year or two. But to build the right number of houses and to build a train line or a train network, you are talking about 5 years to ramp up a housing program, 10 years to build a train plan and build a train line. So these are uncertainties which we have to live with in a very volatile world.
Thank you, Chairman. Prime Minister, I'm Janice Koh. I'm an artist as
Yes.
well as a nominated member of Parliament. Earlier this morning, we talked about the need for building resilience in government and how that would mean greater variety and diversity within government. And to build that resilience, we need to avoid, rather than avoiding conflicts or shocks, we need to look at a variety of views. If we were to extend this argument to building resilience in our society in general, would you agree then that we need then more space for discussions that could potentially be polarizing or encourage a whole diversity of views? And if so, how do we balance that against building what you call a cohesive society alongside a resilient society?
I think it depends on issues. It depends on the maturity of the population. For example, if we are talking about economic policy or social policy, should we have more welfare? Should we have more state involvement? Should we have more government ownership and nationalization or more private sector? These are things where a range of views are natural, and in every country you will debate them and the pendulum will swing sometimes one way, sometimes the other. And I think it's normal and healthy. It's a way to adjust to new situations and new political pressures. There are other issues where discussions can easily and rapidly flame up. Race, language, and religion are one of them. You saw how this woman, Amy Cheng, the one who, is that her? Amy Cheong, the one who posted a rant on her blog, and overnight people were very upset. Hundreds of thousands of people were very upset. Just 40, 50 words on a blog. Race will always be a very sensitive matter. Religion will always be a very sensitive matter. Less so than before. We discuss many things openly now, which in the past we would have hesitated to do. How our different religions shape our perspectives and views. How our different races perform, either in school or how successful they are in society and in their careers. And these are things which previously you pretended were not issues, but we are able to talk about them. But to think that you can just take your hands off and just leave it, I think that's very unwise. Even in the art scene, in a play, and even if you have something which is supposed to be a parody or satire, not everybody will see the satire. And people can be grievously hurt, and I think understandably look for some support and protection. There are also other issues which are not race, language, and religion where we are not likely to come to a conclusion anytime soon. You look at the gay rights movements and pressures which exist in almost all the developed countries. actually all the developed countries without exception. In America, they are much more open than we are, but the matter is not over because homosexuality is perfectly legal. The next pressure is gay marriage, full equal treatment. In France, they've had a pushback and they've had demonstrations in Paris against gay marriage. In Russia, where a lot of things go in many directions, they've had a pushback in the Duma. They've just passed some legislation against gay propaganda or something like that. I'm not sure what that is, but there is the conservative groups in the society want to maintain society as it is and don't want to see the whole social landscape change. So these are not issues where we can settle one way or the other, and it's really best for us just to leave them be and, well, we just agree to disagree. And I think that's the way Singapore will be for a long time to come.
If I may go back myself to a previous question on parliamentary representation, if I push the envelope a little, I mean, on one end you have first past the post system, the other end you have proportional representation, but there are systems that mix the two.
Yes.
Like Germany's, I mean, you have first past the post system for constituencies. In addition to that, you have a slate that is distributed according to the percentage of votes political parties receive. Right? Might that be considered sometime down the line?
Well, there are reasons why countries have done that. I mean, one of the reasons is because they need to bring in people who may not be certain of winning an election, but whom they need on their team. Yeah. I mean, some of their ministers, for example, come in on the party slate, and then if you're high up on the slate, the chances are you'll get elected, and then you can form a cabinet. If you don't have a party slate and you're just first past the post, and you don't have a safe seat, you may or may not get the minister you need. And if it's an ordinary ministry, it's not hard to find another person to replace him. If you need a finance minister or a defense minister, it may not be so easy to find the man you need. So there are reasons why other countries have done that. We had one overriding reason why we did not go for a system which is based on proportional representation or even a mixed proportional representation. And that is because we believe that with PR, in a multiracial society, you are going to encourage polarized race politics rather than centrist multiracial politics. And in fact, it has happened. I mean, you look at New Zealand, for example. There's a New Zealand First Party, which is basically a Maori party. And it could not exist except that they have this mixed PR system. And we think, and I think correctly, that that would not be good for Singapore. So I never say never, but there were reasons why we settled on this model with GRCs and mixed representation in the GRC.
Yes, please. Diane, Prof. Koh, and then...
Thank
no,
you, PMA,
sorry.
Koh Tai An from NTU Center for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. I'd like to ask you a question about ideology and values. Right, Channing Chi long ago in a paper had mentioned that the PAP and the government then, or perhaps even now, is defined by its pragmatism. Right. This morning we talked about values, which you also raised up, the 4 values of diversity, rule of law, and so on. We've had debates about core values and national values. And one of them being family, for instance, which has not been brought up today, the building block of society. Then we had that big debate on Confucian values, Asian values, right? Now I'd like to ask, what is it would be your current, what drives you and gives you, particularly your party and the government, a particular vision that enables you to deal with a whole slew of difficult questions now? For example, take the question of meritocracy, right? Of course, it goes back to Confucianism and the exam system, which people are complaining now gives them so much stress, but which is considered as bringing forth merit. So therefore, there is rewards go to the Mandarins, which is good. We should have Mandarins in government. But then, in Confucian system, if certain kinds of merit are rewarded, perhaps in excess, other kinds are not. So hence we have this inequality. Years ago, then PM Lee had a Use Your Hands campaign to emphasize the dignity of labor. But we are paying people who are in these so-called low-skill jobs, very low pay. So take, for instance, its implications for childcare, right? We say we need more childcare centers, we need more preschool. But currently, these jobs are valued lowly. People are not successful academically, perhaps it's a perception, or it's just seen as childcare, so they're paid low. At the same time, if they're paid low, then we need immigrants, because immigrants' labor are the ones that are cheap labor, right? And if we don't pay them, then Singaporeans not going to do it. So you can't carry out your policy if you don't have the labor. And it boils down to the value, as to what value we give to people who work equally hard and so on, but they don't have the merit of being academically inclined. And back to this idea of many kinds of intelligences, many kinds of merit that we should recognize. And also pragmatism, which puts in a way a value, often a monetary value on qualities, so that this old morally desirable frame of mind that virtue should be its own reward is undervalued. So we pay people for being moral. You know, we pay children, you know, who are so and so. Everything has this kind of monetary reward. So what I'm asking is then finally, what are the kinds of values? You know, take for instance law and order. Law and order becomes double-edged because it can be used against people, right? So
Can I answer your question, because you have elaborated in considerable detail? I think when we say, first of all, we did have a debate about shared values, I think about 20 years ago, and we settled on a list including family, including meritocracy, including multiracialism, and a few others. At a broad level, I think we endorse them still. How exactly they get interpreted, what they mean in the society, not only does it vary over time, I think different people in society will interpret them differently. Which is why we never went beyond broad principles to elaborate an ideology, because it cannot be done. Because once you put it down, what does it mean, family as a building block? What is the family? Family with one wife, family with two wives, family, open family. I mean, there will be no end of arguments, and we just left it as a general principle. What makes us what do we aim for today? I'm not sure you can easily boil it down to one or two sentences, but I would say you're aiming for a society where everybody has a place, where we give everybody a fair chance, and if you come from a disadvantaged background, I give you extra help to make sure you come to the same starting point. Meritocracy does not mean money to the mandarins. I think I've never seen that interpretation before, and I don't think that is a right interpretation. Meritocracy means I choose the right man, the best man for the most difficult job. I reward people for their contributions, but at the same time, I must also give everybody the chance to compete fairly in the race, and I must make sure that the losers also get some consolation prizes. How big a consolation prize, how you define winners and losers, well, that is something you have to discuss. And in fact, we have defined winners more and more broadly over the years because we want to recognize ability and contributions in many directions, not just examinations or being a civil servant, but whether it's in arts, in social service, in sports, in leadership. I think that's the right solution for us because we can mitigate meritocracy, we can help it to work better, and we can make sure that there's always a hope that if you make the effort, you can take the next step up. Doesn't mean you will automatically, everybody will reach a top, but if you make the effort, you can make the next step up. You may have gone to N levels. You can work hard, you can make it to O levels, you can get to the poly, you can get to the university. Some people go on to do PhDs. Not everybody, but the door is open. What has made it more difficult for us to make that system work today is that the rewards have become stretched out in Singapore as well as in other countries. So, if you are very successful as a professional, you can do very well financially, not just in Singapore, but really anywhere in the world, because the doors are all open. And therefore, the pressure for everybody to want to go up that single path becomes more than before. Within Singapore, we can mitigate that, because within Singapore, we can say, well, you're a childcare teacher, I make sure you're paid properly. You're a school teacher. You may not be the top lawyer, but I make sure you're also paid properly. And I try to balance the income distribution within Singapore and push against the stretching out and the increase in the Gini coefficient. To a certain extent, I can do that. But it is not so easy to change people's mindsets that if I have my son, if he can only get into that school instead of this school, that stream instead of this stream, that course instead of this course at university, well, then his future is made. And we try very hard to make sure that there are many other courses and schools and streams and options. But to persuade parents that this is so and to accept that their sons can be happy in different ways, or daughters, I think that is something which is not just what the government says, but really social attitudes and social perspectives, and something which we have to work at.
Prime Minister, the perception has taken place that the people who have made it in Singapore constitute an elite, and a self-replicating elite. The word has almost become a dirty word. In fact, this morning, Minister Lawrence Wong was almost relieved when somebody said he was only almost elite. Now, how do you deal with this? I mean, the fact is, someone like the PAP candidate in Punggol East, though he came from a poor background, he made good. He became a colorectal surgeon. Was nevertheless perceived as elite, and that the government as such, constituted by the elite, have difficulty establishing a connection with ordinary people.
It takes time, but if you have the right man, I'm sure he can do it. And I have no doubt that the candidate we fielded, Ko Po Kun in Punggol East, would be able face-to-face to connect with people. But if you just see his photograph and you don't know him, then you don't know whether it clicks yet, because it takes time. And unfortunately, he did not have quite enough time, and so he didn't win in Punggol East. But I think this is a matter also of social attitudes, of feeling that if the person succeeded, well, he did it through his merits, I would like to emulate him. As opposed to, he's done so well, why does he deserve to be there? Let's pull him down. This is a very fundamental difference between what America used to be and what Europe tended to be. I hesitate to generalize, but in America it used to be that if you've done well like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, everybody says, marvelous, I wish my son were like him, and he deserves his billions. But in Europe, the attitudes are different. Somebody makes a fortune, he says, he must have he must have exploited the system somehow, cut the tall poppy down. And we ought to have a system where the people have a chance to go up, and where people feel that if my son is good, he can get there. I think that's not easy. Hong Kong has tended to shift from one to the other. Once upon a time in Hong Kong, people looked at the tycoons and said, that's the way. One day I'll be a tycoon too. Not even my son, but me. Work hard and we will get there, like Li Ka-shing. But in recent times, in recent years, I think they look at the tycoons and they say, I'll never get there. Why is he doing so well? And I think that it is very important for us to keep the system open, that there is an elite. Every society has an elite. You may call it or not, but there is one. Even in a communist society, it makes a difference. And you know the stories in the old China, in the old China of Mao. The difference is everybody wears a Mao jacket, but the elite, the Mao jacket has an extra layer inside of wool. Keep you warm in winter. So that there is an elite happens in every society, but it has to be open, and the elite has to feel a responsibility to the society it belongs to. Otherwise, the people will ask, why am I supporting this system?